Hello, folks, and welcome to Totally Tanked. My name is John. I'm joined by
Rob. Hello.
And it is episode 39. It is the
Sunday, the 13th of November.
Black Sunday. Okay, and we are talking about, what tank is it this week, Rob?
The T-90, the Beast from the East.
The Beast from the East. And I did a fantastic, if I say so myself, graphic, which come up somewhere behind us. There we go. That's where you folks will see it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
We are Totally Tanked. We're a tank podcast talking about tanks and
beer.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's do a little bit of housekeeping first. We have patrons, Rob.
We do. Magical people that love us very much, and we love you.
Their names are going to come scrolling across the screen in a second. And we've got very exciting news because we sold a couple of T-shirts this month. T-shirts, redbubble.com, totes tanked. Totally tanked, one word. Or patreon.com, totally tanked. And we do appreciate that. So between our 4 patrons and our 2 T-shirts, we made more money than the hosting of this podcast by, I think, about $2. And that means we're more profitable than Twitter. More profitable than Twitter.
Yeah, put the crypto into that, Elon.
Yes. So, folks, just to make it clear, obviously we are live right now as a YouTube live stream. We are also recording as a podcast. And that will go online. Yes, so that's all really good. Now let's talk about the T-90.
Let's do it. So, you'll never guess where the T-90 comes from, John. It's Russian.
It's Russian?
It's Russian. And properly Russian as well, because it didn't actually... It was while they were looking to upgrade the T-72 back in 1989, just by the time they came around to developing the T-90, the USSR had fallen, it had split up, and they were saying, we're going to take this T-72 BU that we've been talking about, and we're going to give it a new name for a new country, and it's going to be the T-90. So it's a different tank than the T-72, and it's the T-90 based upon the T-72, but it is a totally different tank, and it is Russian.
It's not a totally different tank.
It feels different in itself. It self-identifies as a different tank.
Yeah, I would say also that the T-90 as entered service in 1992, I think, is quite a different tank to the modern production T-90. So a modern T-90, M, I think they're calling it, is almost more different from a entry production T-90 as the T-90 was from the T-72.
Just like the modern Abrams is totally different from the one that entered service in 1980 or 79 or whatever it was.
Well, more differences there. It's got a different cannon.
Yeah.
Hugely different engine, different art. Anyway, but it looks the same. Okay. Now, as part of this story also is that in large part the T-90 was a T-80 turret on a T-72 chassis, although the turret had some similarities, but the systems were heavily influenced by T-80, which is a tank we will talk about at some point, but
not today.
Not today.
Except in reference to the T-90. Right, so it's a third-generation Russian main battle tank, developed in 1989 as the T-72 BU. But after the USSR split, it wanted a new name, so it became the T-90 and entered service in 1992. It then went through a number of iterations. They didn't build many in that first 10 years because they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't know who they were. They didn't really have an identity for themselves. And the T-72 and the T-80 and the T-64 were still going around and being useful. So what's the point of spending all this money on a new tank when you have all these old tanks already there? And then it went through, it became the T-90 in 2004. Then the T-90, and then there's a lot of overseas, basically. We've got to talk about India, John.
Well, we definitely need to talk about India. In many ways, this is much more an Indian tank than it
certainly is. Basically, the Indian government came along and said who already had 2,000 T-72s, said, you know what, we want an upgraded tank to counter the Pakistanis' purchasing of the T-80s from Ukraine back in 1995, 1997. And so they put in an order for this brand new T-90 tank, and that is what propped up the Russian government to be able to continue production of the T-90. Otherwise, they were going to say, you know what, we're just going to scrap this and stick with the T-72s and the T-80s. But because the Indian government put in the initial purchase of I think it was 500, and then up to 1,000, and then now they're up to 2,000.
It's something like double the number of Indian T-90s in existence than Russian ones.
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, they propped up the Russian industry of the T-90 so that they could continue developing it as a third-generation tank, whereas the T-72s and T-80s were only second generation. So that got them through to the T-90M and then the T-90MS in 2017. And there's also overseas sales of the T-90S, which is mainly to, as we said, mainly to India from 2004. But they've also upgraded theirs. And we'll get onto theirs later. Some basic things with the T-90. It sticks with the Russian proviso of the three-person crew with the 125mm gun. Round about 50 tonnes, so slightly heavier than the T-80 and the T-72. 12.7mm external remote operated machine gun, or for the earlier versions, it's crew operated. 7.62 coax. We've got other specs for it. It started out with an 840 horsepower engine. It meant it could move, but still not as quick as everybody would like.
Yeah, I mean, at that point of initial introduction, it was still very much a variant of the venerable KV2 engine, which had entered service in the late 1930s. And that was, while an absolutely genius engine for World War II, was definitely well past its use-by date by the 1990s. So the engine has been upgraded over the life of the T-90.
Still only up to 1,130 horsepower. So
which
is still
for
less,
a 50-ton tank is still...
And still less than the gas turbine of the T-80.
Yes. Yeah. Although it doesn't run out of fuel in combat situations the way the T-80 does. So swings and roundabouts on that one. And
can go to altitude better than the gas turbines, which is important for places like India. 550k on-road range at 60 k's an hour. At 6 k's an hour top speed on road, or 45 k's an hour off road. At 11 k's an hour.
You and I have now been in a T-72 going around a dirt track at probably no more than 30 kilometres an hour.
Yes.
And this is the same suspension.
Yes.
60 would be teeth rattling.
Yeah, rough. You would not want to turn. You want to be going straight.
Yeah, over pretty smooth ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's or actually sitting down in a seat rather than standing up in the turret.
Yeah, even sitting in seats, it's going to be rough at those speeds with that suspension system, though.
So 11 k's an hour reverse speed, so twice as fast as the old T-72s. So that's a big change for them, and the T-64s. Steel composite reactive blend armour. They started off with cast turrets and then eventually decided to go to welded turrets because it's a bit more stronger.
Yeah, I mean, unless you have sharper angles, which for the shapes they were trying to have to defeat shape-charged weapons was important.
Right. They had does have ERA. They use the Contact 5 packets on the older versions of the T-90. And
now, one thing I've noticed with Contact 5 is people, don't know who, seem to think there's significant differences between Contact 5, Series 1, Series 2 and Series 3. I don't have any clue as to what those differences are, but they do appear to matter to people who take pictures of T-90s. Excuse me. But I also, part of me is like, why would you have something called Contact 5 and then not call the next version Contact 6? But so there's obviously something within the Russian production procurement system felt it was important to keep the name even as they went through significant marks.
I'm sure the Contact 5 is just the Western translation of what is very descriptive in Russian.
Well, I mean, it's spelled with a K. It sounds pretty Russian. And Relict, the previous system, was spelled with a K as well.
Relict is the new system.
Is that? I thought Contact...
No, okay. Relict is the new system that they've got on the latest T-90M. Mm-hmm. And it is supposed to be much better.
Okay.
And offer much more protection.
Also spelled with a K, though, so that's authentic.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I'd still say it's probably just branding and a Western translation of what something is very descriptive in Russian.
Now, it's built by the Ural Vagon Zavod company.
I'm assuming that's just in Tankergrad somewhere.
In Nizhny Tagil.
Yep.
Yes.
We believe that. Somewhere in the middle of Russia that builds tanks. And Haven't bothered looking up. I'm not sure they'd be allowed to.
Yeah.
It's 2.2 metres high, so about 7'3", 3.7 metres wide, and 9.6 metres long, so about 32 feet long, and 6 road wheels. It has the Stora anti-missile jammers.
Oh, can we talk about them?
I think we need to talk about the Stora.
Okay, so the Stora is why in so many photos, and even the company that makes them, their publicity photos, still have the Stora pictures because it looks so cool. Part of the Stora system, which is quite a complicated protection system with a lot of laser receivers that automatically fire smoke launchers, and that's all quite useful. But it also had these giant infrared emitters, which made the tank look like it had giant red eyes staring at you.
Scary red eyes.
Yeah.
But of course, you don't actually have the red eyes unless you take the filters off and make it visible, because otherwise it's invisible to the... it puts out light at an invisible spectrum.
Yes.
Because it's infrared.
But the reason why you even have a giant infrared emitter, which in many levels in the modern battlefield, infrared search is a huge part of modern surveillance. You don't actually want to be emitting infrared if you can avoid it, was this idea that the anti-tank missiles being fired at it would use infrared signals from the commanding controller, so the soldier who's fired the missile, to guide the missile to its target. And if you shone enormously bright infrared lights back, then the controller wouldn't be able to be seen, or the command loop wouldn't be able to be closed. With these systems. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you try and describe it, frankly.
Well, it's just like the old Leopards used to have a great big infrared spotlight, so they could wander around, because in the days before thermal sights, they could wander around and have a spotlight that would shine out into the dark.
Yeah, the M60s had that too.
That you couldn't see with the naked eye, but if you're in the tank with a pair of infrared goggles, you basically then had a spotlight that you could see things with. But once thermals came along, having a great big beam of light showing your position was not a good idea.
Yeah, but the biggest problem was this particular countermeasure of these giant infrared emitters was entirely to try and futz the command system of a very particular model of anti-tank missile, which, once the countermeasure was known, just switched over to a different command system, and making the whole thing completely useless and redundant.
But it does look scary when they show the red eyes of the tank coming out of the darkness.
It does make for an intimidating-looking tank for Western journalists. Yeah.
But as I said, you only see that when they want you to see that, because otherwise it's just naked to the invisible to the human eye. All right, so...
now, we've got some viewers watching. We've got 2 of you at the moment, which is awesome. Cornelius is watching us from a bar in Western Creek. Far off and distant Western Creek.
Or the other side of the lake. We don't go there. It's dangerous down there, Cornelius.
Okay, all right. We've got another viewer at least on the line, so let us know where you're watching from, and we will progress from there.
All
sure.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, the T-90M is very modern tank for the Russians, and it's not quite up to the T-14 Armada, but
it exists.
It exists.
Which the T-14 Armada doesn't.
Yes, 19 of production versions.
Pre-production versions.
But the important thing about the new things that the T-90 can say it has that a lot of Western tanks does not is air conditioning. It has now been upgraded to have air conditioning inside the tank and a reversing camera. Now, both of these things, we were discussing what modern Western tanks have these. We're thinking
Toyota circa the 1990s.
Not a tank. Sure. It's just really useful for killing them once you put your ATG
pods on it. Yeah.
But the reversing camera, so we're thinking the Australian M1 Abrams also have air conditioning and a reversing camera. We're not sure that the actual US Army versions have that. We know they don't have air conditioning.
Well, they do have cooling units for the targeting computers.
Well, that's not very good for the people inside them.
No, but there is some cooling, but it's not. It's not pointing at the people. Look, we've talked about this before, but let's talk about it again. There's a school of thought that's like, big tough tank drivers should be big tough people, and the answer is yeah, probably. But the tougher you are, even no matter how tough you are. If your comforts are being looked after and you're getting fatigued less rapidly, you can stay combat effective for longer. And that is a good thing when you're putting a 19-year-old in charge of a multi-million-dollar piece of very important equipment on a battlefield.
Yeah, and not running over local villages. There was a good comment I was reading on the interwebs the other day about an M1 Abrams crew, and they took some, and they were doing their training up in some hot place in Nevada or California where it was 117 degrees, and they were fine with it because they were the regular crew and they were used to drinking their water and having everything else. But they had some reservists joining their crew as forward observers for the day, and they went through. His crew went through 3 reservists in the space of about 4 hours as they just passed out from heat exhaustion from sitting inside the tank as various things happened, and eventually the exercise had to get called off because so many people had collapsed from heat exhaustion on the exercise that the range control could no longer guarantee everybody's safety because they couldn't evacuate enough people if something went really, really, really bad.
I would also say with that when you're taking reservists and putting them in a real live tank, their excitement and adrenaline levels are probably significantly elevated anyway.
But just think if they'd had air conditioning,
it would have kept them cool in every sense.
Yep, yeah. There you go. All right. That's now numbers. I'm a little unsure of the numbers because of the way they've put out how many have been built for which countries, and then you throw India into the mix of how many they've bought and how many they've assembled themselves and so forth. But we're looking around 3,500 tanks all up, but I'm not sure how it all goes. So at present, Russia's supposed to have 417 T-90As and T-90s, T-90As and T-90 and 200 and Ms.
Are you talking the Russian numbers prior to January 27th?
Yes, they have been building more, and I'll get onto that.
They're not building more in enormous numbers, though, because one of the distinguishing features of the T-90 is the use of Western electronics in a Russian tank. And when we say Western electronics, we're talking about things like computerized displays, stuff that the Russians can no sooner build than fly.
And when we're saying Western, we're talking France.
Well, we're
talking France.
They might think from France. It's coming out of the Far East as well, but they're part of those Western supply chains and Western markets of which the Far East is part. So the Russians haven't had access to any of that stuff since they started the invasion, and they don't appear to have stockpiled heavily on parts either because they didn't. It was going to be a 3-day operation, Rob. We're talking about the war in Ukraine for future listeners. Sorry. So the Russians have got some really big problems with producing more because while it seemed like a really quick fix to take a whole bunch of Western electronics to improve their solid T-72 tank chassis, what they've done is make it almost impossible to build more without Western acquiescence.
Yes. So they've got supposed to have about 200 in service and 200 in storage of the 400 plus that they've actually using now. I bet those...
Of which the storage ones, I guarantee you, have been pulled out of storage.
Quickly put back through their paces. As I said, these articles were written a while ago. Syria's got 40, so they were given 40 in 2017. They had others beforehand, so again, they were more recent versions of the T-90Ms when going over there that was for the Assad government forces, not for anybody else, unless they captured them themselves. Turkmenistan has got 10 in 2010.
We've got a beautiful image in the slider behind us of the Turkmenistani T-90s on parade in front of the presidential palace.
And they've got 30 more ordered whenever they might be delivered.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't be waiting for my delivery of Russian tanks at the moment. I don't think you're going to get much out of their factories for a while.
No.
But it's worth noting, if it wasn't for the Indian orders keeping the Russian industrial capacity going, the Russians would be in even more horrific trouble than they are.
Yeah.
Because those production lines were built to service the Indian market.
Yep. And speaking, we'll get to the Indian market, those bits in a minute.
Should we talk about the Armenian T-90s?
I was going to say, I'll just go through to the Uganda's got 44. Again, Uganda seems to get tanks from... There must be some rare earth metals there that are getting traded across to Russia for them to be getting a lot of tanks that Russia wants to maintain. Oh, hang on, Wagner Group was involved in the Ugandan Civil War, wasn't it? That's where it was. Yeah, that's where they are. The little green men again wandering around Uganda. Now that I remember that.
In fact, probably the Russian T-90s were delivered for use by the Wagner Group.
Yeah. That makes more sense. Ukraine has captured at least 12 T-90As and 1 T-90M. Now we'll come back to that one because that's a big step for.
That was very embarrassing for the Russians.
And it was an intact one as well. Vietnam has 64. T-90S and SKs, which are the command vehicles. Algeria has 572. That's a sugarload of
well caught. Yeah. Algeria is almost as big an operator as Russia. So that's something to really think about. I want to just note that Armenia got their first T-90 when they won it in the tank biathlon.
They won. I thought they got given it so they could compete in the tank biathlon.
Oh, it's my Wikipedia entry here is saying it was won in the tank biathlon. But they have since ordered. Here it says between 10 and 30, which that's a big margin of error on the number.
Yep. Well, we don't, now, what's interesting for me is the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war.
Yes, that was our first war on this podcast.
That was between Armenia and Azerbaijan, whereby Russia supplied both sides with T-90 tanks, even though they're aligned with the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis supplied by the Turks. Is that right?
It's complicated.
Too many A's in there for me to keep straight.
Yeah. Russia has traditionally been a sponsor of the Armenians, but that conflict was very much what the Russians call a frozen conflict, where they like to make sure their neighbours are fighting each other and then they tamp the fighting down but make sure the resentment lingers, and then when it's politically useful for them, they let the fighting flare up again. And a big risk at the moment is no one's as afraid of the Russians as they were 10 months ago. So a lot of frozen conflicts look like they're about to become unfrozen as various people decide they're going to murder each other and there's nothing the Russians can do about it.
And all the Russian peacekeepers in those conflict
areas. They're long gone.
You reckon? Because they're still in Moldova, they're still in Azerbaijan, they're still, or Armenia, that area, and they're still in Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. I think there's still Russian peacekeepers.
There's a lot of frozen
from those frozen conflicts.
There's a lot of frozen conflicts, but I just if I was the Russians, now admittedly they haven't done a lot that's smart or insightful in this conflict, but when you're literally relying on tax police to hold sections of front line around Kharkiv, I don't think
these are twisties.
I don't think you're leaving a whole lot. In the peacekeeping role, those long-term professional soldiers are getting pulled into Ukraine. There can't be very much that isn't actively training the conscripts that spare. All right, because they are losing so badly.
But while that Nagano. I'm just going to say that
the Armenian Azeri conflict.
Too many Karabakh conflict. There was a big use of drones, of tanks, and a lot of destruction of armoured vehicles. But again, as we said at the time, it came down to the light infantry being able to climb over great big yamas, mountains, and getting behind people that really sort of made a difference.
Yeah, although, as we said at the time of that conflict, the drones did play an enormous difference in pinning the Armenian forces down. The Azeri tanks played an enormous part in pinning the Armenian forces down, and then the light infantry got around to the key crossroads behind the pinned down forces, and it was largely game over.
And the T-90s and T-90s were...
Sorry, a dog's just crawled under Rob.
He's going to get stuck.
I think there must be lightning around.
All right, so yes, and there were T-90s involved in both sides of the conflict there, and the Armenians captured one of the Azerbaijanis as well. And anyway, the Azerbaijanis do have 200 T-90s. The Iraqis also have 73 of the T-90Ss and SKs. But then India has the 2,000 T-90Ss, and they've called their own version is called
Bhishmas.
Bhishma. Mm-hmm. So cannot remember the name that they've given it from the Mahabharata.
Yeah, right.
From the epic.
It is, as India has many heroes of their legends, and this is one.
Glorious warriors all. And no. So and they come up with I think it's not a bad thing to be naming tanks after these glorious heroes of times past.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. Yeah. Pity about poor old Arjun. He's. I think he copped a bit of a dud there in the
naming stakes.
He's a better guy than that.
It's a bit like some Americans say. There's never going to be a tank called a Westmoreland, but there's definitely an Abrams. Yes. And a Bradley. Yes. So, other things we want to talk about with these, I think, in terms of general principles, what you've got. And it's a really interesting fallacy to fall into because in 2022, I don't think we can say this is a good tank in 2022. I think you can say it was a competitive tank in 1990.
Depends on the conflict.
Yeah, but compared to other peer tanks, it's always been a cheap tank, and that is worth bearing in mind. It's something like a third of the cost of...
$2.5 million US dollars for the older versions of the T-90, $4.5 million for the T-90M. So that is a very cheap tank for a modern third-generation tank. And look, I've got to say, the T-90M, or even the MS, is a much better tank than a lot of other things out there that are fighting in the conflict in Ukraine. I
think it's still you've got the big fundamental problem. It's got an autoloader and an ammunition carousel in the crew compartment, which was a risky trade-off in the 1970s and is an unacceptably risky trade-off today with top attack munitions. You've got what was fundamentally,
You mean the turret ejection system?
Okay, let's call it the turret ejection system.
Now, the T-90As, or up through to the Ms, did suffer that same thing, that the ammo was all stored in the turret, and the carousel was underneath the feet of the crew members in the turret. So, yes, everything else would just go, as soon as there's any sort of fire inside the turret, everything would go pop, boom, bang, everything's dead. And a great big fireworks show coming out of the top of the tank. But the M, the new version...
Some of the ammunition's in a compartment in a bustle with a blowout panel, but not all of it.
No, there's still the carousel is still loaded with ammo, which...
But let's talk about the other problem with the carousel and the autoloader, which is that the new long rod penetrators...
I'll just stick with this for 2 seconds, because they have actually put some ballistic spalling, lining and so forth around the carousel, so if a fire does get into the turret, it's less likely to blow up.
There is a reduced percentage chance of everyone dying instantly. Yeah,
and they might actually get a chance to climb out and run away type thing, or put the fire out. But, so there's, rather than as soon as there's a fire inside...
Would you stop and put out the fire if you were in a tank?
Well, I would hope the automatic fire extinguishing system would go...
The idea is the automatic system goes pop and the fire's out before you can even react, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But if it's anything more than that, it's like, hatch open, I'm getting out.
Mag off, pack off, fuck.
Yeah. And I would note that level of fear is only if you've got, large numbers of rounds of ammunition stored in the compartment that you're in. If you're in a modern tank where there's nothing that can explode in the crew compartment.
Or even catch fire.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, if a bit of paint's caught fire because of some minor penetration, you might try and, put the fire extinguisher on it. I'm not suggesting all tankers should be cowardly or that I'm inherently more cowardly than anyone else. I'm saying that if I'm sitting on top of a carousel of ammunition and there's a fire going, in that case, I'm just getting out of there. And I don't think I'm alone in that perspective.
Yeah. But so the latest version does have better protection for the ammunition in the carousel and the extra armour in a blowout bustle behind the turret. So it's less likely to go up in flames, but that doesn't mean it's not going to. All right, now let's go on to the ammo, John.
The fact it's not long enough.
It's not long enough. So one of the issues of maintaining the turret from the T-80s and the T-72s and the autoloader is we get what? The same rounds can only be, there's no room for upgrade or improvement in the size of the rounds.
Well, once you've got the autoloader to fit with the carousel, anything that makes the breech longer and makes the ammunition longer makes them fit less. They're heading in opposite directions.
John's waving his hands around for our podcast listener.
Yeah, I think that point worked without... Anyway, let's keep going. So the problem is that you can't make the ammunition longer, and modern developments in discarding sabot ammunition, where you're basically throwing an enormous dart, is that they've decided that longer darts...
do more against ERA.
We'll do more against thicker armour.
Yeah, thicker armour, ERA is explosive reactive armour and everything else, and be able to penetrate the bits of a tank to get to the squishy bits inside and kill them off. Now, so longer darts is the way to go, and the T-72, the T-80, and the T-90 are all limited to the original darts that come with the autoloader,
which is the 1960s design. And oddly enough, with all the incredible advances in material sciences and computing in the preceding half century, that design is no longer competitive. What was they were saying in that video we're watching, it's still fairly lethal.
That's right, yeah. Yes,
not lethal, fairly lethal.
Well, if you were in an Abrams getting shot at, if you'd managed to sneak up on an Abrams, they hadn't seen you, and you managed to get a shot off with the 125mm round, you'd still have a decent chance of taking it out, or a Challenger, but it's only fairly lethal. There's not guaranteed kill, whereas because the Challenger and the Abrams have been able, because they're crew loaded, they're not limited by the autoloader, and so they can just make them longer and get stronger people in there and say, yep, get to work you lot, and you've got a longer dart.
It is one of the advantages of having a human loader, in that they're a lot more flexible in their ability to handle different shapes and sizes of objects. It's kind of weird when you think, yeah, human's big advantage. Oh, we're
adaptable.
We can lug different size and shape heavy objects around. That's what we're good for.
That's why the space shuttle has human-sized robots in spacesuits. There is some thunder out there. My ride home tonight will be a bit wet, I feel. But it was a chance I had to take. But the T-14 Armada, John, they do have a longer darts inside of it, because they don't have anybody inside the...
Totally different autoloader system.
All 19 of them.
Yeah.
Which will never be seen anywhere outside of a parade ground, I think.
Look, I mean, at the moment, I would say the T-14 Armada is more of a technology demonstrator, which means that a lot of the concepts in it might well turn up in a real tank at some point in the future, but it should not be viewed as a real tank. Sorry, Russia fanboys. Yeah. The Russian fanboys, they're a bit of a paper tiger. They've all gone very quiet.
After Ukraine's handed.
Yes.
All right. So, yes, they got aircon in 2008. They had NBC protection before that, which NBC protection will get the air moving and basically inside the tank and push any nasty particles outside, but it's not air conditioning.
But it does integrate well with an air conditioning system, it's worth noting.
Yes, reverse speeds.
Yes.
What do we think about reverse speeds, John?
We think that, as we saw, we talked last month about the classic video out of Ukraine of a Russian T-80 and a Ukrainian T-72 dancing backwards and forwards to see who could get a shot off. They were on a constricted narrow road with a crossing over water and scrub all around and some rise and falls in the road. So it created a really interesting dynamic of who could actually get their gun onto the other one. And in that situation, having the faster reverse speed meant the difference between living and dying.
Yep, for those poor bastards involved. And we think of everybody who are driving around tanks at this moment on either side saying you're poor bastards, and we hope everybody gets home safe.
Yeah, it's important to remember that real humans are dying in these things. It's not just a video game.
So we're the team Colonel Desabre from the defence of Bastogne and his... M18 Hellcats decided that, you know what, we want tanks that can reverse back and forwards really fast and manoeuvre around urban environments. And that's why when he was designing the Abrams, he said, we want something that can move backwards fast as well as reposition as forwards fast, and which is why the Abrams can do 30 k's an hour in reverse. The T-72s, the older T-72s, the T-64s, and can only do 5 k's an hour in reverse, which is a big difference. But the T-90s, they can do 11 kilometres an hour in reverse. So that's a big difference for them. Twice as fast as the T-64s and older T-72s.
It's an interesting thing because to most people with most vehicles, a reverse gear is just something you use to enable a position change. It's not an operational thing. As in the reverse gear of your car, you use it to back out of a driveway, but you wouldn't ever want to drive any distance backwards.
Well, the tanks don't want to drive any distance backwards, but what they want to do is
they want to get fast out of there.
They want to take themselves out of line of sight of somebody aiming at them really quick. So that means I need to move 9 meters backwards really fast because that's the length of my tank. And if somebody's got my tank painted up, I want to be not where that image of the tank was. So that's 9 or 10 meters backwards fast.
Yeah, but there also just comes a point where you suddenly need to get behind the next ridge or the next tree line without doing a 3-point turn.
Which is putting your rear to the enemy, which means there's a lot less armour there.
Yeah, and that means scooting 100 metres, 200 metres in reverse, maybe even a kilometre in reverse.
And which tank do we know that does that really well? The S tank. Oh, and also the Black Panther.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're just, we'll make jokes about French tanks having more reverse gears, and those jokes are funny.
They are funny.
But
reverse gears matter.
Yeah, it's underappreciated by folks who have only looked briefly at the world of tanks, and once you think a little bit more about it, having a very fast reverse gear...
Like the Archer.
Well, the reverse gear was basically the forward gear in the Archer, but yeah.
John's wearing the Valentine t-shirt, which is what the Archer was based upon. And yes. So they just they just drove it around backwards.
Yeah, we gave them a 17-pounder gun, so yeah. Anyway, the point remains, reverse gears are more important than you might think, and the Russians have, obviously, in the last 40 years... gotten a little bit less terrible with their reverse gears. But, their original thought was we're all going to go crashing through Fulda Gap and charge towards the English Channel. And why would you need a reverse gear for that?
The North German plains, yep. You don't need it for that because you're going straight forward across that nice open tank country. But now
it's full of nuclear landmines.
Nowadays they're finding out that... actually, they found it in the First Chechen War that in... urban environments, which is where the T-80s really failed them.
Let's talk about that.
This is the first Chechen War of 95, so the T-80s failed them there. And because they were in an urban environment whereby they couldn't reverse out, and the Chechens took out 200 tanks in about 10 days. The
Chechen Wars are super important for the story of the T-90, so let's delve a little deeper here. Weeks before the First Chechen War started, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but a moderately competent Russian general was sent out to get the troops ready and looked around at the forces that he had to invade Chechnya and called Moscow and said, it will take me 6 months to get these troops up to combat effective status. We have to delay the invasion. And Moscow said, ha ha ha, that's very funny, go. So they went in with troops that even their commander had assessed and knew were not ready. For numerous reasons, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and troops being horrendously neglected, and Russian troops have been horrendously neglected by Russia since, I don't know...
Since Russia was formed as an empire.
Since about the 1400s. Yeah. Anyway... So there's that, and they charged in particular with T-80s into downtown Grozny, and they left them at street corners with their gas turbines running, and they all ran out of fuel. And the Chechens seem to have been really well informed that the imminent running out of fuel was going to happen. And once the tanks had run out of fuel, they came up and fired RPG-7s from rooftops down into the top armour of the tanks, and a lot of T-80s died pretty much on day one of the war in Grozny that way. And that war dragged on for a while, and Russia essentially lost the First Chechen War. And they went in, and that was part of the reason why they developed the T-90, was being like, we need a better tank. There are some bits we like in the T-80. There's a lot we like in the T-72, and they brought those elements together into the T-90, and they went back into the Second Chechen War. And
Dagestan in 99.
Yeah. And more or less kicked ass in the Second Chechen War.
Yeah.
And the T-90s against RPG-7s were quite effective with their protections against that, and there are lots of stories of them shrugging off numerous hits, and very few stories of them being killed. And the Chechens, who had enjoyed tremendous success against the T-80s, were not very happy about how they went against the T-90s. Future politics of Chechen fighters and Islamic State. Anyway, there's a lot of it's complicated. We're not going to get into the detail of now.
We are not that masochistic that we want to get into that.
Yeah, and it's also not that T-90 related. But the point is, T-90 was immensely successful at the initial conflict it was designed to do, which was go out and Chechens actually revolutionized guerrilla warfare at the time because they went away from having fire squads of light infantry with Kalashnikovs to essentially a Chechen fire team was 2 RPG-7s and 1 Kalashnikov. And as a combination for a light guerrilla force, that was extremely powerful and effective until they came up against T-90s, which could just basically pretty much defeat the old RPG-7s. T-90 was very good in that, but what you've got is an evolutionary development of a tank that was a really good design, what is now 50 years ago, and you've got to remember that the T-90...
30 years ago.
Well, I'm saying the T-72 is a 50-year-old tank design.
Yes.
The T-90 now is older than the T-72 was when the T-90 replaced it.
Wow, yep.
Okay, so it is very long in the tooth for all that the T-90 MS is a relatively recent upgrade to that.
But it really does show the point of being a third-generation tank. It can shrug off those RPG-7 attacks, so it's still vulnerable to anti-tank guided missiles. It's the MS, the M version is survivable against those, but by making the T-90 survivable to RPG-7, which was the most common anti-tank available piece of kit through that time, and still probably nowadays, but being survivable against it means that any sort of conflict involving T-90s and other third-generation tanks, that you need to have more capability against it. So what was your term before? Increase in capability tier of what's going to actually take it out, something like that. So you've got to go to anti-tank guided missiles rather than RPGs.
But when we talk about the legendary survivability of Challenger 2 and the days when it shrugged off 70 RPGs in Fallujah or something like that. Sorry, not Fallujah. Anyway, but that was RPG-7s. It was pretty much the same munition that the T-90 is good against, and how any of these Western tanks go against NLAWs, against Javelins, against whatever the Russians come up with next, which will all be overflying the tank and then dropping a shape charge down.
Superheated shape charge.
Yeah.
Down into the top attack armour. Yeah. So that 99 Dagestan War, the Second Chechen War, basically made the T-90 and showed its capabilities over the second generation tanks that had gone previously. Speaking of conflicts, yes, we'll quickly go into Donbass. So that was the first invasion of Ukraine by the Russians in 2014 and taking Crimea and Donbass and Luhansk when they said, yes, we're breakaway republics, and look at this, we seem to have some very modern tanks on the battlefield. Where did they come from? They're part of our People's Liberation Army or whatever they want to call themselves. But yes, there is lots of conflict with them there. Once the lines of conflict settled down after 2014 and just became a various internal strife and civil war there. We didn't see a lot of armoured thrusts through the area until this year in 2022 when the full invasion happened, and now we've seen lots of T-90s going across the battlefield. Big one is the T-90M was captured back as part of the Ukrainian offensive to take the Kharkiv area back in September. Mm-hmm. And they captured a T-90M. So this is the most modern version of the T-90, and they'd seen destroyed ones, but they hadn't seen intact ones. So basically, as the Ukrainians advanced into the Kharkiv areas held by the Russians just ran away and left behind a lot of kit, including one of these very modern tanks. Now, the Ukrainians have been getting a lot of support from the West. having captured this T-90M, do you think the Ukrainians are going to just wholly give it to the Western countries to say, "Hey, have a look at this," or are they going to bargain for it, or what do you think would be the approaches they take for this sort of thing?
I would imagine there'd be some bargaining.
I mean,
I think another 6 HIMARS systems would probably
because the West would love to have their hands upon this tank to say, okay, what is it? What can it do? What's its vulnerabilities? What's its strengths? Can it penetrate with the ammunition that it has inside of it? And can it penetrate an Abrams, Challenger 2, what have you? And what countermeasures can we build for those that sort of information? Does the anti-tank guided missile that it fires, can that be countered by the Western tanks? Is the dart big enough to go through the armour of the Challenger 2 or the Abrams, or what other tanks that they might be fielding? The Leopard 2.
Look, I would be very surprised if you could penetrate a Challenger 2's glacis plate with one of these, what is now ancient weapons. It's a 125mm smoothbore gun that was absolutely terrifying in the 1960s, but particularly because they can't update the ammunition because, as we've discussed, the problems with the autoloader. We're talking multiple generations of Western tanks have been designed purely around defeating this round to the front.
But they haven't had... Well, they've been able to see what the older versions of the T-90 have done and it could do. This is the T-90M does have a newer gun. It's still the same gun essentially, but there are newer bits to it that they don't know what capability increases it provides.
Yeah, I just think fundamentally you're talking about as we've discussed, very old tank design with some Western parts. The Western powers know what those Western parts bring to the party. I'm not saying that getting it to Aberdeen Proving Ground and giving it a thrashing isn't on the priority list for Western tank designers, but the propaganda value of losing their most modern battlefield tank is the biggest thing for the Russians. And in terms of intelligence analysis, it's useful, but I don't see it as being game changing.
I think the Ukrainians will be selling it. It is game changing, and will be saying,
"Oh, when they're trying to sell it, game changing, comrade."
So it is a big. I think it is a big deal for them, and that whether or not whether or not they're hanging on to it in order to redeploy it themselves. But we're assuming that they're going to ship it straight across to Poland and say, let's get it off across to Ramstein Air Base, and who wants to have a look at it first, type thing for the small price of another 6 HIMARS or something fun like that.
I just think, and I've sort of touched on this before, but I'll repeat it now. It's a really interesting example of incremental design has its place, and when it reaches its endpoint, it will give you a world-beating vehicle. But once you move beyond that high point of incremental improvement, what you're stuck with is an aging design with faults that are utterly exposed and utterly out of time. And I think the Russians probably should have been moving on from this tank design. Probably, when the T-14 Armata first started surfacing, if they'd actually been able to transition to full-rate production, that would have given them a modern tank. But what they have here is the T-72 was a great tank design in the 1970s. It was well out of time by the 1990s, and this is carrying on so many of the design defects of that original design that it was not a bad tank when it entered production, the T-90, but now, you may as well be sending up biplanes.
Oh, they use biplanes, they use those as drones.
Yeah. We're going to talk about drones in part 2 of the show.
That came out in the Nagorno-Karabakh.
A biplane does give you a lot of lift.
And that was we talked about that one previously, using the biplanes for that. What else do we want to say? Look, Syria. Okay, So the Syrian civil war. However you want to name that conflict is, the various factions against the Syrian government There's a lot of conflict happening there. The Russians want to support the Assad government and have given them a lot of support, including lots of tanks and mercenaries and even troops on the ground. And T-90s. There's lots of videos of the T-90s being hit by the anti-tank guided missiles used by the various factions against the Syrian army. Lots of them surviving, mainly lost. They've found that by using the tanks better with infantry support and not putting them into environments whereby they're going to get ambushed by lots of anti-tank guided missiles, they're more survivable. Surprise, surprise. If you actually use the tanks the way you should be using them, which is with infantry support and in the environment that they're supposed to be used, they are far more survivable. But they are surviving those hits from the anti-tank guided missiles with the armor and even the Stora. I wouldn't say it's effective, but I'm sure there are some tank crews out there that are very grateful they had it in the time that they needed to use it, and there's plenty of videos of that going around showing the tanks getting hit by anti-tank guided missiles, it going pink, and then having the crew climb out very quickly because they're saying, well, I don't want to be in here if somebody else is shooting me, and they wish they had a faster reverse speed.
Can we quickly talk about the impact of India on the development of this tank?
Yes.
Okay. Really important, and this is a signal moment in the changing of the system of the world. So in 2005, the Russian army went down to the factory, so I'm not going to try and repronounce it, anyway, and said, we would like some more T-90s for the Russian army, and this is the specification we want. And the factory said, how many of these do you want? And they said, 14. 1-4. Okay. They wanted 14 more tanks. And the factory said, well, we've got a production line here running full tilt building specification for the Indian army who want hundreds of tanks. And we're not going to do you a production run of 14 tanks. And so the Russian army had to accept that what they were going to get was what the Indians wanted.
Yep.
Now, the real thing to watch for is the next step in this is, because we know through the Arjun, which we talked about in the Arjun episode, the Indians do not plan to forever buy their tanks from Russia. They definitely plan to be designing and building tanks themselves.
And now they've lost one. They've failed with one with the Arjun. They're going to get the next one right, obviously.
Yeah, well, they're going to try again. But the big thing is that the shape of the T-90 owes far more to what the Indians want. Owes far more to what the Indians want because they actually buy them in numbers, and not from the basically bankrupt Russian state, which can't order them in enough numbers to make it worthwhile for a Russian factory to build them. And that's a really big thing to think about with how the world's changing and going. Cool.
What was I also going to say about the Indians? So the Bishma, yes, they've got those.
Also, Indians have cooler paint schemes.
They do.
They're awesome.
Other places that we're looking to buy them. Some have been, at least one has been captured in Syria by anti-government forces. Egypt's looking to buy 500. Kuwait is also looking to buy 146. Malaysia thought about buying it, but instead went with the Polish PT91M. Pakistan wanted 600, but eventually as an upgrade for their Ukrainian T-80s, but eventually went for the Chinese VT4.
I imagine the Russians might have had some hard conversations with the Indians about that order as well. There might have been some other factors there.
With the Pakistani one?
Yeah, and then the Indians saying if you start selling to the Pakistanis, we're not going to keep buying. Yeah.
So and again the Indian delivery ones are, as with the T-72s, there are some delivered fully built, and many more, and twice as number of them delivered in pieces and then assembled within India and rolled out.
They call it knockdown kits. But, yeah.
IKEA. I wonder if they come with their own
little Allen key. Yeah.
The IKEA Allen key. All right.
I bought a new bicycle the other day, and I was astonished the tools that came with it. I got a decent pedal spanner and a good multi-tool. It was good.
All right, I think, John, now's the time to go to our...
Okay, so we're going to have a chat with Dr. Albert Palazzo about the Australian infantry fighting vehicle purchase.
Yeah, this is going to be exciting for you all, so enjoy that for the next...
It's about half an hour, and then we will be back. Great. So we are joined now by Dr. Albert Palazzo, who is an adjunct professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. And he has recently written a paper on Australia's choice of infantry fighting vehicles for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, otherwise known as ASPI. We will have links down below for that paper. But Dr. Palazzo, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
And just to get us started, can you walk us through a little bit of what defines an infantry fighting vehicle and why the Australian Army is getting into them in 2022?
This is a vehicle that the Australian Army doesn't actually have in its current inventory. We have, what
the M113
APCs or protected mobility vehicles. But this is an entirely different kind of generational leap in capability. This is a vehicle that carries people, soldiers, in the back and is tracked like a tank and has a turret like a tank carrying probably a 30 millimeter gun and a machine gun. It's the concept here for it is that it will allow infantry to fight to the objective, to ride in the vehicle if need be, all the way to the objective and get out on the objective, or even roll through the objective into the rear and then dismount in the enemy's rear, which is these vehicles come with a high degree of armor protection, which allows them to do this. Whereas the 60-year-old M113, which is beyond obsolete at this point. I'm not sure what the word is after obsolete.
Dangerous.
You couldn't do that. You have to get out some distance from the adversary, and the infantry has to walk forward and then fight their way to outside of the vehicle. Fight their way on foot to the objective. So this is a faster, more secure, and hopefully more powerful way to fight. And this is also the way every other modern army does it at the moment. So Australia is playing catch up in this kind of, in this part of modern land warfare.
Australia's always, previously, a generation ago, Australia's always seen itself as having light infantry and without a requirement for the idea of having heavy or mechanised infantry, only having 5.7 RAR as the actual, what it was back then, 5.7 RAR as the mechanised infantry. Nowadays, we're going far more into either the mechanised infantry role or the cavalry role, whereby they can pick up dismounted infantry battalions and actually advance them forward with the cavalry. That's a big change for Australia, saying, yes, if you want to get in, which essentially why there wasn't a lot of involvement in Gulf War 1 back in 92, whereby the 91, 92, whereby Australia didn't have the equipment to be able to deploy overseas to those sort of environments where it was a highly armoured, highly mechanised environment, and which weren't invited. Whereas nowadays, if we want to get invited to those sort of conflicts, not that I'm saying we do, but the government is looking at it and saying, look, we want to be able to have our place on the world stage and be involved in this. If we're going to get involved, then we can't just have light infantry walking around the hills of Afghanistan. We've got to be able to actually put some mechanised infantry on the ground, or to be able to move around in a protected environment. Do you think that's one of the issues that's going on here?
Well, I think there's two things at work here, and they're both interrelated. So the first one is that Australia, the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, the Australian Army, and the Australian government all got seduced by the idea that we could go to war and war wouldn't be terribly dangerous, that we could control the environment to the extent that we could achieve objectives while also minimizing casualties. And that's what you see in our parts of Iraq and Afghanistan, a relatively low intensity war against a relatively low threat, and with a heavy degree of management on the part of the government deciding what we could and could not do. And the other thread here is that the government, really since John Howard and the decision to go to war in Iraq, has consistently signaled a desire for casualty minimization. That either even one or two or three, or that day in Afghanistan when 5 Australians died, that is always going to be too much. One Australian killed in action is more than that should be occurring, because the government wanted no casualties or 0 fatalities.
That's just
and
like
that's why we're
just like in 1966 in the Battle of Long Tan when 18 Australians died. It was a big moment for the government. The M113s were in at that battle and had only been introduced into the Australian Army in 1965, so only a year in with in operations. But now
the M113 would just simply not survive on a contemporary battlefield.
No, aluminium hull. And
so as we're seeing, the lethality of the modern battlefield has become much more intense. It's much more lethal. And wars where the adversary is, like in Afghanistan, a lightly armed insurgency, they don't pose a real serious threat. But you don't get you don't always get the war you want, and usually the enemy also gets a vote. And so Australia could easily find itself in another war in the future, in which the adversary comes with quite heavy weapons and quite lethal weapons. And the only way to survive in that kind of environment is upgrading your land forces to be able to take the battlefield.
There's some discussions about whether or not Australia should be getting involved in those sort of conflicts, but that's a different discussion. Yeah.
But yes, it's a different discussion, and it's also a decision for the politicians to make. It's up to them to decide what kind of wars we go to. But often there's a lot of surprise in war, and even non-state actors now have fairly easy access to relatively powerful weapons that could incinerate a Bushmaster or a Aslav, and certainly eliminate an M113.
So,
the question the government is asking is, how do we survive on the modern battlefield? And the IFV is a potential answer to that.
Yeah.
Speaking about Aslavs, sorry, John, you go. You've been quiet.
Thank you. Sorry, Al. Wonderful piece of understatement in your article. You did mention that $27 billion is quite a lot of money.
It is.
And this is like a third more than we're spending on our fleet of F-35s. It's a colossal defense expenditure.
Yes. Well, there's two things working here. One is the Army is much too honest about costs. So that $27 billion.
Unlike those damn Navy folks.
That term $27 billion covers pretty much everything for, it is not the sticker price. It is not going to the IFV car yard and buying 450 of them, right? Okay, it includes the training costs, the new facilities, the logistics support. It includes replacements for in case any of these do get blown up. So it's a full figure. Whereas you mentioned, the Joint Strike Fighter being around 35 billion, but that figure is just simply nonsense because the RAF very cleverly neglects to include all kinds of additional costs that it then covers with supplemental budgets. So it's very almost impossible to figure out what is the Joint Strike Fighter costing because it's spread out into numerous programs and that are constantly evolving, and all the upgrades that are coming for it, like the software upgrades that are required that are issued by Lockheed. All of these are costing extra money that were not in the purchase price. So, saying that these are very expensive, absolutely, but at least you know that this is what it's going to cost you.
Now, I've got two questions with the with going to the tracked vehicles with the Redback or the Lynx. First off is Australia previously with the ASLAV and then the Bushmaster went with wheeled vehicles. Now, I can see a number of benefits of those within Australia and basically being able to use them and deploy them and train with them in Australia, and that you can go long distances on a wheeled vehicle that you wouldn't want to do in a tracked vehicle. So if you're driving around the Northern Territory for 500 k's from one training area, from your base to a training area, you're not going to want to do that in the back of any sort of tracked vehicle. Whereas an ASLAV or a Bushmaster would probably be able to do that quite happily, carrying a squad of troops. Now, that's a recommendation for those vehicles for moving around Australia. Now, it does make them more survivable in a hostile environment whereby somebody's actually shooting back at you, but it is a large consideration for why they might have chosen those vehicles. When the ASLAVs came in and back in the early 90s, so it's a question of was that a consideration of, when they were looking at the tracked vehicles for the Redback and the Lynx, is that something they want to be doing, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, through the entire development program for Land 400, most of it takes place behind closed doors. So I don't really have good visibility for why they decided to go down the track route very early in the piece as opposed to giving consideration to wheels. There are certain advantages to going with tracks in the ability of them to go to more places than wheels will get you, and over harsher terrain than wheels will get you. But the distribution of weight, because these vehicles are so heavy, tracks allow you to distribute the weight much more widely than a wheeled vehicle, so that with these IFVs and tanks too, which are even heavier, the ground pressure isn't all that much different than your family car.
No.
So these are all the kinds of considerations within it. But what was the initial decision to look at tracks? I had no visibility of that decision, and so I really can't say.
I agree that by having tracks, you can put a lot more weight on the vehicle, which means you're putting a lot more armour around it, making it much more protected. But for an Australian environment, as I said, I wouldn't want to be one of the squaddies sitting in the back of a tracked vehicle driving from Robertson Barracks somewhere out to 500 k's down the road to carry out some sort of exercise.
Speaking of squaddies, the capacity of these is 6 dismounts, and of course, an Australian infantry section squad is 8. Are we going to be looking at a complete reorganisation of our platoon structure?
Well, I think inevitably, yes, something's going to be done there because for these mechanized battalions, they're going to have to change the squad structure. Which it's you just do. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, I believe the U.S. Marines, the U.S. Marine Corps, their squads are 13. So there's a range of squad sizes.
They're probably divided into 2 vehicles there.
Yes, but there's no one golden mandatory squad size. It varies, and then you adjust and you reorganize how you fight based around that. So yeah, so there's going to be some adjustments and some learning, but it's all within the realm of of not that big a deal.
I can see how your 8-man squad can be reduced to 6 by having the vehicle acting as your fire support in the fire support role rather than the rifleman. But what I would be wondering about is. That's fine when you're a mechanised infantry battalion and you're dedicated to you have dedicated vehicles that you train and work with. When you're just a straight infantry unit and your cavalry comes along to pick you up as dismounted infantry and take you forward, whether or not I'm assuming they'll probably train for that sort of activity, but it still won't be an integral relationship between the two of saying yes, we're now. Rather than being light infantry, we're now dismounted infantry that's going to be taken forward by a vehicle that's only carrying 6 when our squad might be 8 people.
Yeah, so, but they're going to largely, they're going to, they won't have that intimate relationship with the vehicle because they're not mechanized infantry. They're still going to remain light infantry, and so it's an entirely different mode of operation.
Another little thing that I found quite curious is we've gone with Boxer for the cavalry reconnaissance role, and there's a picture of Boxer on the slide. Obviously, that's a wheeled vehicle. Yep. Are we going to be in a slightly weird situation where in some terrain the infantry is going to be significantly faster than the cavalry?
You mean in like very damp terrain?
Well, any sort of off-road environment, really. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes that is the case. If you're in an urban setting and there's lots of rubble on the road, even tracked vehicles will have difficulty negotiating that. And so that's why you do have a mix of options, and you try to pick the one that optimizes the situation that you find yourself in. And so, a good commander should be able to have a degree of flexibility in how they optimize that force package based upon the situation. But you make these decisions, and then you have to live with them. And so that's what Army's going to have to do, because one is wheeled, one is tracked.
Yeah, I guess it struck me as an odd decision to have an orphan family of vehicles when you could think one of these IFVs could fill that cavalry role.
Well, if you ask the people in the cavalry world, they would disagree with that completely.
Sure.
But maybe that's core pride speaking there.
Now, another question with the two options with the redback and the lynx. So one Ryan Mattal, one Hanwha. Sorry.
Hanwha, yeah.
So we got South Korean versus German engineering. Is there any sort of thoughts about leaning one way or the other, whether it's to open up the production of South Korean military vehicles into the wider world, or is it just maintaining?
I'm quite agnostic to either vehicle. They're both meet the remit, and somehow those making this decision are going to have to pick one of the two, and I don't know how they're going to do this, because they're both highly capable vehicles that seem to be heavily armored as you want, able to carry roughly the same amount of stuff. So you go redback, you go lynx. I don't know. What I would say is that you got to go with one of them. You definitely have to pick one.
Do you think Ryan Mattal?
Army needs one of these.
Do you think Ryan Mattal has got the upper hand by going with the redback, which being the iconic Australian household deadly spider, versus the lynx?
You mean Hanwha? You mean Hanwha?
Hanwha.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, and then they named the self-propelled gun after another spider.
Yeah.
So
I'm going.
Yes.
People who've listened to the podcast before know I keep getting those two mixed up.
Yeah, I mean these are government decision making. That they're going to look at what the cost is, what the local input is into the manufacturing, what provides the best job basis, what is the best maintenance down the road, and that's and then they're going to make a decision. For somebody like myself, looking at these vehicles, they both look like they fit the bill. And I don't really care which one you get.
Another question I've got is, and myself talking to mid-ranking army officers, and I think you might have had similar conversations, is vehicles keep turning up, the Hawkeye and more heavy, increasingly heavy vehicles, but the logistics and maintenance and all of those operational things that need to come with them, the Army's still got a lot of work to do with actually supporting this proliferation of vehicles, don't they?
Yes, well, and there's again, two factors here. One is, the Army doesn't just go off on its own and makes these decisions. They follow the lead of what government wants, and government wanted a vehicle that's heavily protected to, safeguard the lives of soldiers, and that immediately closes off all kinds of doors because, usually a lighter vehicle is easier to maintain, does cost less, and is able to, sustain more easily going forward over the next, few decades. Heavy vehicles are expensive and harder to maintain, but government has repeatedly signaled they want something that's, heavily protected. So Army is just following government's, wishes here. But the other part, the question about logistics, about sustaining these things, this is nothing new here because, Army and Navy and Air Force, the entire ADF have neglected logistics since 1901. Right? We have never bothered.
Well, the British take care of it for us.
Yeah, well, exactly. In the First World War, most of the logistics on the Western Front to Australian units was provided by the British. And there are very few incidents in the military history of Australia when Australia had to support its forces on its own. Very few. Most of the time, we just got somebody else to do the logistics for us. Now, that comes with problems because, sometimes you can't keep these vehicles going, or, your troops might have to eat, herring, and they might not like it, like when we were working with the Dutch. Yeah, but
the country supplying the ammunition won't supply it anymore because they're a neutral party and don't want to participate in whatever activity we're involved in.
But this is 120 years of Australian logistic policy. So it's nobody should be thinking, oh my God, we're getting these heavy vehicles and we're not going to sustain them. I mean, we haven't been able to sustain our equipment forever. We always go to some other bigger country to do the heavy lifting for us. If you were serving in Vietnam, the fuel that you used in your APC and your M113 was provided by the Americans. The ammunition is provided by the Americans. The spare parts provided by the Americans. So, that's the policy. Now, we could change that policy, but then we'd have to spend more money on logistics, find more soldiers to work in the logistics arms, and bear that expense ourselves, which can be done. But until government changes the logistic policy, that's not going to be done. So, don't be surprised.
And they can't recruit for the people they do need right now. So it's unlikely to be able to get more people into uniform if they can't meet the target numbers at the moment.
Yeah. Or you do what other countries do, is that you rely on contractors, and we rely on contractors to the point that we actually deploy contractors, to the front or just behind the front, and those contractors do vehicle maintenance, perhaps under fire, and that's the contract they sign. And Rob, this is happening now. In other national armies. And it's happened in the past.
I remember when the British brought it in, so from the base to the foxhole, or whatever it was called, the catchphrase, and suddenly they were in places. Then the caterers said, "You know what? We're not going to the foxhole."
Well, and you just have to change the contract and find somebody who's willing to do that at the right price.
Luckily enough, the labour laws in most Western countries have changed so that you can force people into foxholes. So,
Huzzah! just before we have to go, you mentioned in your paper the increasing threat of drones on the modern battlefield, and that our investment in these vehicles really needs to be matched by either counter-drone, well, essentially some sort of counter-drone plan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, even if we weren't buying these vehicles, all right, even if we didn't own a single vehicle, and then the Australian Army got around on foot, okay, you would still need some form of counter-drone defense for your force. It's now become mandatory. If you're going to operate in anything resembling a contemporary warfighting environment, and you don't have protection overhead, now that protection can come in many forms. It could become other drones that hunt the other side's drones, or electric kind of discharging electricity discharging ordnance that would fry the drones.
Trained eagles.
Somebody has tried. They used hawks.
Yeah, so it was hawks. So you're right.
Yep. You can shoot a shell that opens up and throws out a net. There's all kinds of options here. Or just refine the proximity fuse so that it can recognize a 2 kilo drone and detonate in the proximity of that drone. So systems out there exist, but for whatever reason, Australia has not pursued any to date, and this is a massive oversight, and it's becoming more urgent day by day.
Because anti-aircraft sort of capability is usually situated with the artillery. By not, is it something within the actual army itself saying, well, that's their role, rather than saying, no, it's a part of all integral vehicles to have this sort of capability of basically air protection from small anti-personnel or light-skin anti-armor type drones. I don't know. It's just a thought that's going through my head.
Rob, have you got any other questions?
No, I'd just like to thank Albert so much for these discussions, and we wait with bated breath, I guess, as to what the decision is made and how many we end up with, whether it's 450 or 380 or fewer.
Or zero.
Or I doubt. Do you think we can push the M113 out for another 60?
Yeah, well, you never know.
No, you don't.
All right, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about on this subject, Al?
No, I'm all right, John. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for the conversation. And hello, folks. We are back.
We are back indeed. And
so that was obviously pre-recorded. Thing...
Don't worry, I drank some beer while we're doing it.
Yeah. One thing I would like to note that I probably should have mentioned, well, it was a half-hour discussion. We covered a lot of territory. Every other country in the world, an infantry fighting vehicle is doctrinally there to keep the supporting infantry in contact with the armour. So it can move over the same ground the armour can, and it can keep out a somewhat level, similar level of...
That's hear in the background, not air raid sirens or anything like that.
Yeah. But anyway, the point of an IFV is to carry infantry with the armour. In Australia, our purchase appears at this point to be based around simply having a really tough battlefield taxi so we don't take losses of our extremely expensive and extremely well-trained infantry. So that's just a bit of an interesting difference that if we had had another half hour to talk to Dr. Palazzo, we could have gotten into.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob, what are we up to?
We're up to beer review.
Sorry, I just had to get my beer glass. Beer review!
This ain't no grog or ale. 1 pint down, you'll be swinging in the gale. 5 pints, buddy, you'll be shaking in your shoes.
So what do we got here, Rob?
It's it says it's a Styrian Wolf Hazy IPA Urbanaut, but I've crossed out the T and made a Syrian Wolf Hazy IPA. So, as the Syria being an operator of the T-90 tanks, I have decided this is a... Oh, can I even crack it without breaking a nail? It is a...
I mean, you do have beautiful nails, so...
I do have beautiful nails.
That would have been a tragedy.
I like to maintain my nails. I don't paint them or anything like that, but it wouldn't be bad if I did.
This is the smelliest beer I've ever encountered. Like, you crack it and the whole room is just filled with the fresh fruit aromas of sweet tropical mango, passion fruit, and lime.
Hail to the crushing smashability of our Styrian Wolf Hazy IPA, named after the Central European hop, so maybe it comes from Ukraine.
Well, it's no, Styrian hops. Styrian, yep, okay.
I don't know where that Styrian is.
No.
That gives this beer its potent fresh fruit aromas of sweet tropical mango, passion fruit, and lime. This is a thundering, thirst-quenching juice bomb. Rejoice ye! Drink fresh, stay rad.
A thundering bomb, that sounds very tankish.
It does.
Yes, so...
And it's got a wolf right on the can.
Yeah, it's got a wolf on the can. Wolf looks a bit like a boar, but...
yeah, it's very... Very Chinese art style wolf, but anyway.
Yes. Sorry, that was the sound of a dog playing a ukulele, so that's not something you hear every day. It says, drink fresh, stay rad. What brewery is this from?
As we all...
The Urbanaut Brewing Co. So it's a New Zealand brewery from Auckland, New Zealand.
Yep.
I don't think I've ever heard of the Urbanaut Brewing Co.
Well, we have now. Urbanaut.
Like I said, you just crack this can and the whole room fills with
fresh mango and lime. Sweet tropical aromas.
I was talking to someone the other day because when we were up in Cairns, there's like 4 or 5 breweries in Cairns. There's a lot more than you expect for a town that size. And all of their breweries are producing tropical fruit flavoured beers. And part of me is like, just because I live in an area... Well, okay, if I lived in Cairns, if I lived in an area that grew tropical fruit, would I want my beer to taste like tropical fruit? And I'm not entirely convinced that's a crossover I'd actually want.
No, there was a lot of bottles of orange juice in the breweries that they just pour straight into the vat.
Yeah. I didn't see that.
Yeah, when you go to loo in one of them, you could see into the brewing area and then just lots of bottles of orange juice.
Okay, which isn't a normal beer ingredient.
It is when you want to make something tropical and fresh.
Okay, so the palate on the Styrian Wolf is not... there's a lot of coconut in that.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is actually. Yeah, I can taste that.
I'm not getting mango or lime. I'm just getting coconut. There's
passion fruit.
I can get a little bit of passion fruit, but it's an interesting one in that compared to the aroma, which is unbelievably intense, like I've never had anything like it, where you just open the can and your senses are assaulted. On the flavour front, it's not as extreme. What's the percentage on this thing?
6%.
Oh, God.
It's 6%. It's a... what size can is this?
Looks like a tall boy.
Yeah, is it 450 or is it... Can't actually see numbers. As our older eyes, we have to move it back and forth in front of us to be able to see.
Something tank related and relevant to this discussion. I saw a picture of Rommel trying to read in North Africa.
440 mils. There you go.
Okay,
yep.
440 mil can. But yeah, Rommel trying to read, and he was literally holding this ledger like centimetres away from his eyes, and you thought, wow, he was blind as a bat in North Africa. He was posing for the cameras with his tank goggles on, but he had no idea what was going on around him. Poor Rommel.
He just had to tell other people where to shoot, not do it, not find the targets himself, I guess.
Yes. Okay. Oh, hang on. We've still got the main layup on, so I need to switch us over to Ukraine.
Ukraine.
So we're going to talk a bit about Ukraine before we go. Is there anything else you want to say about the beer? Sorry, Rob.
Look, it has a wolf right on the can,
Yep.
And as I said, I crossed out the T to make it a Styrian Wolf Hazy IPA.
Okay, all right.
So
Good work.
that's my relationship with the T-90s, because I said to John the other day, you'll never guess what beer I've got for this time.
And you know what?
You didn't.
I didn't. No.
All right. Well, we should. Do we come back to the T-90s?
Is there anything else you want to say on T-90s? Sorry.
I don't think there's anything else I want to say, but do we wrap it up and say, we've talked about France and their provision of their thermal images.
Yeah, and also the Indian ones, which we probably haven't talked about enough, is a lot of sub-South Africa systems, particularly the Active Protective System, which is a really interesting tie-in. But so the Indian ones have even more high-tech Western systems bolted onto it. But I just feel at some point the whole T-90 is a really case of an extreme application of lipstick to a pig, which is not intended as a diss on the T-72, which I do regard as one of the greatest tank designs of all time. I just regard it as a really, really old tank design.
You want to move on from there.
And the fundamental flaws and weaknesses of that design have just been laid bare in Ukraine, whereby a top attack penetration of the armour leads to a catastrophic failure. And tanks are hard to replace in war. You can't build them as quickly as you'd like. And tank crews, trained tank crews, good tank crews, are even harder to replace. Any system that leads to their easy destruction is just a waste of time and effort, leaving aside the cost of the tank itself.
Now, leaning into the Indian Bishmar's T-90s, you've still got the limitations of the Russian turret being for elevation depression of gun depression, so you don't have a lot of there. The Indians have some of the T-90s that the Indians were due to have delivered to them and or had sent back to Russia for upgrades have been spotted in Ukraine. So their tanks have been repurposed for active service by the Russians in Ukraine, so that haven't... So
nothing coming off that production line is going to India these days.
No.
Yeah.
So, and the other one is the India is then sending their T-90s up to the Chinese border. So when we talked about in the T-15 episode of the Chinese tanks, that was just after June this year when the conflict was happening up there and the T-15s were being moved up. As a counter, the Indians have moved their T-90s up, which are able to better negotiate the high altitude environment, and they've basically built the roads up so they can get these heavy vehicles up there. So there's still a conflict waiting to happen with the T-15s, which is the Chinese light tank with the 105mm gun. Now the Indians have got their T-90s up there since July and August. They've moved them up there, and in order to counter any activities by the Chinese T-15. So that's still a volatile environment where tanks are facing off against tanks, whereas the Chinese had the advantage of the T-15s being able to operate in the high altitude. The T-90s have been moved up there and are still able to carry out activities. Maybe not as fast, but it's better than T-72s. And guess what? The Arjun did not make it up there.
Yeah, no one ever thought it would. It's a very heavy tank. Might be the heaviest tank in the world, although Challenger 3 is probably going to challenge it for that that opportunity. Alan has asked, where the beer's from. So we did say it's the Urbanaut.
I got it at First Choice Liquor in Canberra.
I don't think that's going to help Alan.
No.
But anyway, it's from Kingsland in Auckland in New Zealand, and it's urbanautbeer.com. So that's resolved the beer. Let's talk about what's happening in Ukraine.
Well,
evacuation of Kherson.
And the next one.
Mm.
So the Russians took Kherson City.
The biggest prize they've had in this war was the capture of Kherson.
And they took that in
Mariupol somewhat, but Kherson's a regional capital.
Yeah, and that was in March, so 1 month into the conflict, so it was something like that.
Can I just say, we are geniuses, because we looked at the map and we said, you know what, that Dnieper River... that's going to be really important to the conduct of this war. Now, I'm not actually...
I think people have been saying that for the last 2,000... Yeah. I read the Romans were probably talking about that about 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, now, I'm joking. I don't actually think it makes us a genius. I do think it makes us... smarter than the non-geniuses out there who didn't look at a map of Ukraine for 30 seconds and say, wow, that enormous river that bisects the country is going to be extremely important to the conduct of this war. It has been, it continues to be. Losing Kherson does mean the Russians have now been completely ejected from west of the Dnieper River, and they did have ambitions to completely cut off the Ukrainians from the Black Sea at one point in this war. And as you can see on the control map behind us, the Russians now have very, very meagre fruits to show from this war, and probably going to be more meagre fruits because the Ukrainians are threatening to cut off that whole southern portion of Ukraine that the Dnieper flows around. They've got the capability, and there's a lot of Russian forces there, and Crimea would go, which is symbolically a big blow to the Russians.
As my mate Dennis, who's a Ukrainian YouTuber, he's a pilot. He was a pilot because he's not allowed to fly anymore because they're bombing the country. His YouTube channel tells me all about what's happening over there, and the poor bugger has to run away to the basement because of air raid sirens and so forth during the middle of his podcast. So thank you, Dennis, for your work. But he's showing how the artillery systems that the Ukrainians have, having recaptured that part of that northern side of the Dnieper River, where they can reach to, whether it's the HIMARS, the German 205s, or the new ones that are coming in that have the, I want to say, 160k range, and so where they can reach to the various bridges of the Russians over to Crimea, and what the devastation they'll be able to cut off the Russian supplies during winter if they can get their artillery systems into position safely, and what they'll be able to carry out now. I'm guessing the Russians at this point, having pulled out of that area, will want to consolidate their holdings upon Crimea and start pushing everybody to get back to the negotiation table and saying, yep, this is what we've taken and this is what we're going to hold, and everybody should go home and be peaceful now. But I don't think Ukraine's going to want that. With the changes in the US midterm elections, that's going to make a change as well, whether or not...
the lack of change, I would say, in the US midterms. If the Republicans had got the red wave they were hoping for, then there was a real risk for Ukraine that they'd be forced to negotiate with the Russians on disadvantageous terms. But, and it's an interesting one where, historically you think of the Republicans as more the pro-war party and the Democrats the
and not liking
party.
The Russians?
Yeah.
Usually the Republican Party's... idea was, during my lifetime...
It's been quite strong being anti-Russian.
Yeah. It's been pretty strong. So the fact that they might be pushing to stop war with Russia is strange to my mind.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a really interesting thing going on with the Russian bombardment of Ukraine with the Iranian-made Shahed drones and a bunch of other drones. There's a school of thought in military thinking that drones are going to revolutionise everything because they're cheaper and they're easier and they'll overwhelm traditional military platforms. Pretty much every drone being used by the Russians at the moment is being made in Iran, but it's relying on an engine made in Austria by the Rotax Corporation, which has very limited production capability.
And it sounds like a motorcycle engine.
Well, it's a bit smaller than that. But what I do love, if you visit the Rotax Corporation's website, which I recommend to anyone with an interest in these things, they've got all these disclaimers about, not for use in these, or these. But they'll take the cash on the barrelhead and ship to wherever in the hope that their how it's to be used won't be violated. But this is not going to scale to skies dark with bombers because the engines are not being produced in those sort of numbers. Yet, I get that they could be, and particularly, for a drone that just poodles along and drops onto a GPS coordinate, you could go with a
cheap and
a lawnmower engine would actually suffice, or a leaf blower engine.
Well, but they're cheap. They go quite a distance, and they keep going, and you can have them mass produced. And the Iranians are saying that they're not providing any more, but however, there are plenty of Iranian cargo planes being seen landing in Russia that where these things are coming from.
And I've got to say, I'm not a huge fan of the Iranian regime. I'm all in with solidarity on those women who are cutting off their hair. Have you seen the flags they're making out of their ponytails?
No.
Oh, these things are incredible. It's like 6 ponytails flying in the breeze as a sign of protest. Anyway, so
the Iranian people, we feel very we want to be free and happy, but the Iranian regime, just like anybody's government, you say, well, what the hell are they doing?
Yeah. Anyway, so my bigger point is I don't know why the West is surprised that the Iranian government isn't helping them out, given how we have treated them for 40 years. We should not be expecting any favours from that quarter. Having said that, given the Republican Party seems to be Russia's best friend, it's hard to say where your buddies are going to be found in any of these things. Anyway, my bigger point, sorry, it took me a while to get here, is...
It's a journey, John. It's all part about the journey.
Yeah, indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations...
and civilian infrastructure
has historically never worked in terms of breaking the morale of the people. Because, and it's quite a simple thing, and if you think about it in your own terms, you'll understand it. If you are having pain inflicted by some foreign buggers who you already hate, them inflicting more pain on you does not make you more likely to want to give up.
No.
If your own government inflicts inconvenience on you, then, screw those guys and you vote them out at the next election.
If you have that option.
But if those buggers over there are lobbing high explosives at you and your loved ones, you don't like that. But what you don't do is capitulate to them because they're doing that to you. That is the last thing that a human response is going to be. It only hardens wills. Having said that, damaging infrastructure can have strategic benefits because it's damaging infrastructure, but in terms of breaking the will of the people to resist, that ain't going to happen. And the world has been trying it since 1943. People say the Blitz, but the Germans just didn't have the horses for that. The Battle of Britain, they just weren't throwing enough at it to even begin to achieve it. But, you look at the Allied bombing of Germany in 43, 44, 45, was not achieving any sort of goal in terms of breaking German will. Bombing of Serbia in the Yugoslav civil wars did not achieve a collapse of will in Serbia for all the battlefield effects it might have achieved.
Bombing of North Korea did not seem to have changed anything there either.
Yeah,
no matter what B-52s you sent over.
Yeah. So.
Should we speak about B-52s?
What do you want to say about them?
Well, Australia has suddenly decided that they're going to base 6 B-52s in Tyndall.
What I loved was people who have supposedly responsible government ministers saying, well, this won't make us a more likely strategic target. Nothing makes you more of a strategic target than a nuclear bomber base. That is guaranteed.
Now, my question is whether or not they're going to be storing any nuclear bombs there. I mean, I'm assuming that they're not allowed to, but who knows?
Well, now that we're supposedly getting nuclear submarines in the forever distance.
But there are no nuclear weapons on them. I'm assuming they're just putting the B-52s there because they decided that Guam is too
and I would say
dangerous.
You can fly a nuclear weapon into a base in about 18 hours notice.
Yeah.
So it's more having the facilities to fly the bombers out there as the precursor rather than the actual basing of the weapons.
Now, and speaking of nuclear stuff and AUKUS, which is our nuclear submarine deal.
Our not buying a submarine deal. Yeah.
Jellyfish, John. Have we spoken about the jellyfish?
In Lake Billy Griffin?
Oh, that's a very good point too. How old were you when you found out there are jellyfish in our local lake?
49.
Yes.
Freshwater jellyfish in our local lake. Yes.
Well, I never knew it either.
No. Slightly terrifying. I've been swimming in there. Anyway, that's of little interest to our broader international audience.
It's something for us. But jellyfish, you've got to stop the ingestion of jellyfish into nuclear subs and nuclear warships.
No, this is just a filter. You put a better filter on the intake and the jellyfish is solved. Like they put those cow catchers on steam trains, you know.
It's just I was when figuring out where Australia wants to put its nuclear submarines, it's a question of has anybody asked the jellyfish?
I'm going to go on a limb here and say Australia is never going to have an Australian-flagged nuclear submarine. This whole stupid AUKUS deal is about us building the facilities so that British and American nuclear submarines can operate out of our bases.
The British are never going to come here.
Oh, they might send a couple of astutes over.
They might come here for a visit, but they're never going to. They're never going to actually work.
You look at what's involved in operating nuclear submarines and the carnage committed on the Royal Navy in the 1960s with their nuclear submarine program, and that was a much bigger country with a much bigger navy, and it's just not going to happen. They're expecting young Australians today to sign up for nuclear technology courses at universities for which there is no promise that there will ever actually be a job, and somehow they have to get them to study these courses, even though there's the very real possibility that they'll never be employed with this very expensive degree.
And they'll probably be here in Canberra at the Australian National University, which is probably one of the few places in the country that actually has the capabilities for doing those sort of studies.
Yeah, University of New South Wales to an extent, but I agree ANU has more gear.
We'll be doing more of the nuclear studies type thing. Anyway, we've digressed probably for quite a long time.
It's not very tank related. Anyway, the point in Ukraine that we need to get back to, because we've got our beautiful map there, is Russia is really struggling. There is a question of what are they doing with all these new recruits. Obviously, some of them have been sent to the front line and died immediately, and that's
shot by their own troops.
That's terrible. But there is the very real possibility that a significant number of them are being given intensive training and won't be seen on the battlefield for many months, and might actually turn things around. And the question that obviously every Ukrainian military planner has got first in their mind is eventually the Russians adapt and stop being useless. Every war the Russians have ever been in, they eventually get their act together. And
they go for the long war rather than the...
Well, it'd be nice if they could, Vladimir thought they could have a 3-day war, but he was wrong.
Then again, there was Afghanistan. How did they go there?
They lost eventually.
Yeah. And they've lost far more in Ukraine than they did in the 10 years that they were in Afghanistan.
Yeah. But if I was a Ukrainian planner, I'd still be... It's victory disease, isn't it? You're always tempted when you're winning to say, stuff it, let's go for break, let's kick them out of every inch of what's notionally Ukrainian territory. But there's a very real risk that the Russians will sort their act out in 2 years' time, and also the Western support for Ukraine is by no means guaranteed, and we have to see how Europe goes through a winter without Russian gas. I know people in Europe who are planning to set the thermostat to 5 degrees centigrade, which is just warm enough to keep the pipes from freezing. There is a very limit to the patience of people in Germany. There's been huge protests in Italy to how long they're going to continue supporting this war, particularly if the Russians have been seen off from what was Ukrainian territory in at January this year. There's a way to go, but if I was the Ukrainians, I would not be messing around. I don't think they've got a eternal license to prosecute this war with Western support.
Now, I think we're pretty much done here, except for the poll, John.
Let's
read out the results.
Sure. We had 7 votes, which is lovely.
Thank you all.
Yeah, the first 3 minutes of this video feed, we had no one watching at all, which is unusual for us. We've often started that there's been a bunch of people watching while we're showing our ass cracks and sorting out the lights. Alan wants to know what bicycle I bought. No, sorry, Alan. It's a Marin Bobcat Trail 5. Trail 4, sorry. I only went
Mine's just a giant Roam 3, which is what I'll be riding home on in the
pouring rain. You can probably hear the rain coming off the rain caps.
But I'll be right.
Okay. The poll. The question was, the T-90 years questions, a great tank a long time ago, bad then, bad now, one of the greatest tanks ever. Rob, which of these options do you think has no answers, no responses whatsoever?
I think answer number 3, John, the greatest tank.
No one thinks it's one of the greatest tanks ever, which I can't disagree with. What we do have is 71% saying a great tank a long time ago, and that's really where I would fall on the T-90.
Do you reckon? Because I think... it was no real upgrade of the T-72 in the 90s. I think actually the latest version is the best version of it.
Well, you'd hope so.
And it is still it's much more capable tank than all the other Russian tanks out there at the moment, and Ukrainian versions of them and so forth, and everybody else's Eastern tank. As a third generation MBT, it is still up there in I'd say in the top 5.
Yeah, but if you put a bunch of tanks in a row, a Challenger 2, an M1, what are we up to, A3?
6, and then a Leopard.
And a Leopard 2, A7, and a T-90 MS.
And what else do you throw in there? The Chinese Black Panther and
K2,
and Japanese M10, something like that, and then the Chinese, yes, yeah. BT4 95 or whatever it is.
Yeah, look, the T-90 would not be the tank I'm getting into.
No, agreed.
We will talk quite soon, I suspect, about the Japanese tanks, but they are built for getting over very small mountain bridges, which is a very reasonable thing for Japan to do. But if I had a choice of what tank I have to fight in, I'd rather the one that can't get over the little bridges and doesn't get into trouble that way. So, again, I come back to Challenger 2/3 would be the tank that I choose to get into. And as we have mentioned, it's no small coincidence that the British aristocracy do actually serve in the cavalry and are much more in danger of getting shot at in their Challenger tanks. And that might explain why they are the best protected tanks in the world. Okay.
I think that's us done for today.
Yes.
Thank you all very much for listening and staying with us all this time. Thank you to Dr. Allen, for Professor Allen, for the chat we had with him. And we'll see you next month for more talks about tanks.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to stop. Oh, yeah.
There's a dog.